Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this really exciting webinar that we've sort of put together uh, with help from IDEX Legal. And I'm very excited about it. And I know that this is a season for webinar overdose. I am aware, I'm cognizant of that. But I'll tell you why I'm very excited about it, because it's the topic, because this is something we're going to focus on, not just what's happening right now. We're going to also focus on what possible and predictive trends in the future. And also because of the kind of panelists we have, because we have a really wide and diverse roster here. Because you have a top HR professional from one of India's biggest companies. You have a general counsel from the manufacturing sector of one of India's largest pharmaceutical companies. You have also a counsel from Microsoft, and his overall responsibility is not just India, but overall entire Asia. And also you have an external counsel who's giving his views. So that's why I think that this is a very exciting panel and session, and I think most of you won't be disappointed. Another exciting thing is we have close to about 300 registered participants. So it's a large virtual gathering. And I think at the cost of overstating a cliche, this is the new normal. I think we're going to do a webinars probably for the near future. Okay, some housekeeping rules before we begin. Firstly, I would like to just point out to everybody that nobody in this panel is airing their opinions and views on behalf of their organizations. This is strictly their personal views, unless of course they specifically state otherwise. We don't want any misunderstandings, and we certainly don't want any controversies. Secondly, it's a 60-minute discussion. It's a 60-minute discussion between the panelists, and we'll keep after that the 15 minutes for Q&A. However, there is a provision for you to, in the chat window, to send us your questions, and if it's relevant, immediately relevant to what the panelists may be speaking, I will loop that in and have the panelists respond to that. But please, accommodate, because we won't be able to take all questions, I'm pretty sure. And also some of the questions we may also miss because we may run out of time. Okay, and the last thing is, while with the exception of Nanjapa, and I'll get to the introductions shortly, with the exception of Nanjapa, the rest for 5 of us are actually lawyers. So there will be a focus on a bit of technicality, but we will try to also keep the conversation as less technical as possible and focus more on the future. We're also aware that along with legal counsels, a large number of HR professionals have also logged into this specific webinar. So we will try to cater to as much diverse perspectives as possible. So without further delay, let me first quickly get to the introductions. I'll first like to introduce to everybody Amit Thukral, who is the General Counsel of Lupin Pharmaceuticals, one of India's largest pharmaceutical companies, and he's general counsel of not only India but also the Asia Pacific region. And as like a general counsel, as the role suggests, I mean, his focus is just not employment law. His is M&A, corporate commercial, intellectual property, disputes. So he brings that kind of wide and diverse perspective because he has that kind of view over what an organization does. So welcome, Amit.
Thank you, Avik. Thank you so much. Thank you for your kind words.
My pleasure. The next we go to is Jaram. He's based in Singapore, so it's a little late for Jaram. So Jaram, thank you for that. Jaram leads Microsoft's commercial legal digital transformation initiatives in the entire Asia region. And in the past, before going in-house, he's worked in some of the biggest law firms of the world, including Allen Overy. Jaram personally is born and brought up in Vancouver, Canada, as an alumnus of the University of Montreal and Western Ontario. And he's also admitted to practice in New York. So I know, Jaram, it's late, and thank you. Welcome aboard.
Thank you. Not too late.
Next is Nanjappa. He's a seasoned and senior HR professional, and his HR experience is close to about 2 decades. At the moment, he leads the employee relations function for Infosys globally, and he also heads the overall HR function for the Asia Pacific and Latin America region. Uh, Nanjappa also holds an MBA, and in fact, he's been a national level athlete also. And I can tell you, I have seen it firsthand from my personal and professional experience. Nanjappa is one of the best HR professionals that I have also seen. So, Nanjappa, welcome aboard.
Thanks, Avik. And I've always loved lawyers, so it's great to have been in their company virtually as well. You can never get away from a lawyer, can you?
Yeah, Nanjappa, I mean, loving lawyers will take that with a pinch of salt. Okay, next, and certainly not the least, I have my colleague from our employment law practice group in Indus Law, Manishi. Manishi actually has overall about 25 years of legal experience. And he's been focusing on employment law, but before that, he's also dabbled in mergers and acquisitions and general corporate commercial matters. In fact, in the Indus Law practice group, he joined us about a little more than a year ago, and he has significantly bolstered our practice and brought about his experience and wisdom. Manishi is extremely important also for this panel because he comes from purely a perspective of how an external counsel looks at issues. So because of the kind of sectors and different clients, sizes, cultures that he deals with, so that his perspective is unique. And needless to add, he's one of the top-rated employment lawyers of this country. And if you don't believe me, please check Legal 500 Chambers and Who's Who Legal. So Manishi, thank you and welcome aboard.
Thank you, Avik. Thank you for your kind words.
All right. So without any more delay, let's get to the meat of what we're going to talk about today. So our first topic that we're going to deal with is what are the immediate changes expected at the workplace and in future in terms of the employee engagement and policy. Now, I'll first bring Nanjappa in the conversation, and purely because Nanjappa in his HR role can actually tell us on how HR professionals and the IT sector in particular is looking at the evolving rules and the engagement practices and protocols that we are seeing today taking place all across us, the changes because of the COVID crisis. So Nanjappa, your thoughts, please.
Thanks, folks, for the opportunity to have this discussion. I usually never let go of an opportunity to collaborate and share. And this time I have an added reason of using my jacket, which I haven't done for a long time. So I thought, why not? So having said that, somebody in the beginning of the year told me that be charitable with your money, not your time. So thank you, participants, for giving us your 1 hour. We hopefully make it worth it. You have an option of watching Money Heist or maybe do a workout or go for a meeting. So hopefully we will make do and help you with that. So having said that, we are still grappling with the whole work from home and office kind of a thing. I was just talking to the panel before the conversation saying that multiple people working from home has never been the order of the day, and all of us are trying to figure out how to make that very effective. So what's happened is that this has been an unprecedented opportunity. It's something that we believe we should look at very positively, because a lot of management beliefs and practices have been questioned in the last 3 months or so. Some of the metrics that we live by have actually meaningless right now. So these are, and some practices we thought will take longer has suddenly accelerated. So there are so many things that are happening around us that I want to talk about 4 or 5 principles based on which the engagement things are going to hinge on. The first thing is organizational resilience. It's amazing that we've seen many organizations react so fast to move their employee base home, and some of them even back to office. The decisiveness, the courage that they've taken has been phenomenal, the nimbleness. So I think the resilience of the organization is paramount in a situation like this. two decentralized framework. If you look at the issue itself, the West is different from the East. Even within India, the states are looking very different. So the whole decentralized framework is going to be very effective. So even within organizations, I think people are going to take different calls based on which location their offices are based, which kind of teams, etc. So I think the decentralized focus and is going to be a big movement forward. Third is self-service. I think engagement is largely going to be self-service. It is going to be very empowering and for people to kind of make their own decisions. And the last one is going to be on work-life integration. For the longest time, I believed that we have to create a great 9 to 5, which is as good as their 5 to 9. And now all of that has come together. So that's something that we need to relook completely. So in the future of work framework, I believe the workplace and the workforce is going to be redefined. The work itself is going to be completely redefined. Workplace, we don't even know what workplace is anymore. Jerome said, when he wakes up, he works. So that's really his work in many ways. So, and of course, workforce, and who are our workforce and what kind of workforce will you have in the future? So these are the things. So in the short term, the key things that are going to be very, very effective is going to be communication, both internal and external. And it's very important I talk about external because it's important how organizations have to rally their forces around what they're going to tell the market. How are they going to interact with candidates, potential employees? What are they going to tell the society? It's going to be critical in the near term. Also with their employees in terms of trust, in terms of transparency, authenticity, in terms of communication. The second thing that will be important will be wellness. Employee safety is going to be at the core of engagement. It's very important organizations look at safety as a key element and at the basis in the near term of engagement. I think that's very important. Third is going to be remote engagement, both on learning front and the connect front. The tools have been used very well today. Zoom is a good example, but the connectivity tools have been used, collaboration tools have been used very well. So that I think is going to be a baseline of sorts. And policies such as work from home and benefits will be completely rehashed. And that has got accelerated. And I think that's something that we need to look out for. In the long run, there are 3 or 4 things that I believe is important. One, leadership and how leadership conducts itself in organizations. And it's very, very important to chart the path. The second would be performance management, both at an organization level and at an employee level. What does productivity mean anymore? I believe we are okay on the individual productivity part, but group productivity, team productivity, how do people come together and we know that they're productive? I think that's very important just from an overall performance management point of view. Third, I think will be on investment of digital experience. Most of the engagement is going to become digital, which means the whole employee life cycle will hinge on how good your digital experience in your organization is. And the last one is partnerships and alliances. How organizations come together to solve a problem will be very, very critical. How employers work with employees, include them in the journey and co-create with them and move forward will be critical in the long run. So these are some of my thoughts, initial thoughts, and then we'll take this on as we go along.
Fascinating, Nanjappa. And a couple of things that I think which sprung out to me is, and for everybody on the panel and whoever's joined in, I think one thing very, it's fascinating that Nanjappa used that term. He said, this is an opportunity. And that's how usually I've seen most top class HR and, sophisticated organizations are looking at this crisis. They are using it as an opportunity to do a lot of things, to move forward, to get people together, to consolidate their resources. But the key word is opportunity. The second thing, and I'm absolutely sure that, Amit, Manishi will be agreeable with me when I say that, I think something people who are not familiar with India, I think sometimes overlook the point is that we have so many cultures, right? We have more than 2,000 states, and each state has its own culture. There are different kinds of people. I once met a European lawyer, and he wanted me to explain how India it is to him. He was completely unfamiliar with India. I said, take Europe and multiply it by 3. In terms of languages, in terms of food, in terms of the way we interact with each other. So our laws, while they are composite and consolidated, I think it's where HR comes into play, is actually how you enforce the policies and the culture and the communication. I mean, I think, at stake at this point of time. And the last thing what Nanjapa said is transparency. And Nanjapa, hold on to that thought because we'll come back to that later. I want to bring in Amit now in this conversation because now, Amit, I would like you to share your views both from a general counsel perspective as well as from a sector which is so labor intensive and maybe does not have the kind of room to maneuver or the kind of benefits that maybe a technology company may have. So, what are your thoughts in terms of how the rules of engagement are changing today?
Thank you, Avik. So, I think I completely agree with everything that Nanjapa mentioned. I think the leadership today definitely has the task cut out for them, and definitely everybody, with the right viewpoint, will be seeing this as an opportunity. Particularly, the evolution of the crisis, how we've seen from severe lockdown to across pretty much all over the globe to gradual easing off, and the gradual realization that this COVID crisis is here to stay. It's not going away any soon. So, how do you cope up with the challenges that are being presented in terms of going back to work? And I think that's significantly what is driving the thought process in most management and at the board level. That this we just have to live with it, and we have to find a way to create a balance between employee health and safety as well as the commercial and the business objectives that we have. So there is a transition in the working pattern and workplace culture. That's a given. And some of us, of course, will be better equipped to work remotely, but by and large, it does seem that there will be restricted. Some of us will have to cope with restricted workforce and workplace restrictions as well. This obviously means that at some level, our employees and workmen would have to go through behavioral changes, and they would have to be more receptive to changes, keeping in mind the health and safety measures. So that's primarily, and in a manufacturing setup, which is something like into Lucan, where we have about 12 plants, over 20,000 employees in the country. This becomes increasingly more important and challenging as well. So a number of issues have to be thought through from a legal perspective, from a general counsel perspective, as you mentioned. The upgradation of our policies around just about from leave entitlement to what would constitute whether. So one of the things that we grappled with, of course, during the challenge was we were exempted pharmaceutical manufacturing of essential medicines was considered an essential service, and they were exempted from the lockdown. And one of the things that we, of course, dealt with was, so our manufacturing facilities are exempted. We have to continue to manufacture, but we realized that a lot of our workmen, because of the entire fear psychosis that was being created around the lockdown, we found that to be a challenge, that people or employees were not actually willing to come back to work, or we had to at least communicate with them effectively, which we rightly did on a very urgent basis. Having said that, we saw behaviors where there was some reluctance at the employee or workman level to actually come back to work, even though a large population of the workforce was willing and committed to playing the role in battling this crisis. So you have to now think about how do you disincentivize that particular group of people from actually flouting what the workplace norms are. Mind you, the government obviously had, at that time, there was confusion around where the government, and it still exists, I believe, where the government had mandated that employers should not deduct any wages, should treat people to be at work, even though they're working from home, or they're not able to commit to the workplace. Keeping all those challenges in mind, we had to define rules to make sure that we disincentivize any opportunistic behavior at the workplace level. At the same time, communicate adequate communicate the absolute commitment to employee health and safety, put in place the best-in-class measures to ensure that there is enough confidence built up in the workforce for them to return to the manufacturing operations. And this is not related to only manufacturing places. Now we have, and I'm sure most other organizations would have diverse workforces as well, but in the pharmaceutical context, you have manufacturing, you have the skilled, unskilled workers in a manufacturing plant. You have the field officers who are the last mile connect to your supply chain. Basically, they are the ones who would make sure that your finished products are actually provided to the last mile. So you have to find and tune specific solutions to each particular work group. So gone are the days where you had a global policy or a large national policy that could potentially take care of each specific group, group of employees' concerns and practices. Here we were dealing with in a situation where we had to find very nuanced sort of approach to how do you manage that particular. So of course and as we go along in this crisis, as more of as we think about opening up our from manufacturing places, we opened up our regional offices, we opened up our R&D centers, we opened up our various other facilities across the country, and we are looking at now, of course, opening our corporate offices as well. So there is a huge thought process around, what sort of policy changes have to be built in. What are the rules around ensuring that their health and safety is prioritized and that is communicated strongly. The various policies that need to be implemented. So the transition in workplace pattern and workplace culture is currently going on. And from an employee perspective, and from an employer perspective, there are various lessons to be learned here. And that's a number of policies that we continue to implement and upgrade. We set up there is a need to set up a dedicated team to take responsibility of assessing and managing the potential impact of COVID. There is a development and implement a business continuity plan. There are a need to establish and maintain a clear internal and external protocols for regular and emergency communication with employees. And so everything. So in fact, at Blueprint level, we've also invested in technology to make sure that contact tracing, to have our own sort of a web app-based platform that can where employees can self-report some of those their regular health status, just to make sure that's over and above what the government has, the Arogya Setu app, which is complete. So these are a number of efforts and initiatives, all aimed at making sure that the employees and the commitment to the employees' health and safety remains the priority, as well as we gradually open up our commercial operations, there's enough systems and protocols in place to make sure that we continue to operate without triggering a major event or an outbreak at the workplace.
No, that's wonderful, Amit. In fact, the key takeaways from what I hear from you is, and I think it somehow ties up to what Nanjappa was saying earlier, is what you talked about, balancing commercial objectives and employee welfare. I think the key is proper and transparent communication, and also the leadership that you and your team and the rest of the senior management colleagues and peers of yours show at this point of time. And that just completely sets in what Nanjappa said earlier.
Commitment is what differentiates, I think, as a sophisticated organization dealing with a large employee base. I think you definitely need to implement the best controls, the best in class possible controls and processes available to make sure that your employee base is comforted in this crisis, in this challenging times.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll bring in Jaram in the conversation right now. And Jaram, where I think that your input is critical in this conversation is because of your role for a lot of Asian countries. And secondly, I think you also see firsthand how a lot of the policy changes and the government rules are getting executed at a ground level, at a wide Asian region. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's actually really interesting to hear everybody speaking, and I think one thing that has come into really sharp relief, well, a few things I think that have come into sharp relief as we go on through this crisis, which is a bit of a marathon of a crisis. I think the first thing that we've seen is, kind of we've experienced roughly 3 years of digital transformation in the span of about 3 months. It's just been, you think about what were you doing in January of this year, and how were you working, and compare that to how you're working now. I mean, 3 months ago, I would have been, I guess we're June, maybe 4 months ago now, I would have been sitting in a panel where this would be an in-person panel discussion, right? In a ballroom at a hotel full of a bunch of participants, but that's not the case anymore. Now, we were perfectly capable of doing this via webinar, but we didn't, and now we've adapted. And so I think that that's been a real interesting development. Really, this whole pandemic, in a lot of ways, I think, is full of contradictions. It's a globally unifying experience in a lot of ways, but at the same time, all of us experience this differently. For example, even the concept of working from home, I think it's an adjustment for everybody, but it's an adjustment in different ways. Nanjapa, you talked about making sure and helping to facilitate a new working environment for employees. But I think working from home is different for everybody. By the nature of my role, I traveled a lot. If I think about my travel so far, this in 2020, in January, I spent a week in Tokyo, and then I went to Canada, and then I was in the US, and then back to Canada, and then I was in India, and then I went to Thailand, and then all of a sudden it all stopped. And I had other trips planned that got canceled, I have not traveled since the beginning of March now. So entering my 4th month of lockdown at home. And that is a very different experience, even though I was already used to working remotely because I was always on the road. I wasn't used to working from the same place remotely for quite so long. Contrast that with my wife, who worked from home, has a home office, and now it's an adjustment for her because I'm always here on top of her in her home office, and so that also is, a challenge. And you think about if you have employees who are working from home offices, think about, they've got children there now, they've got, spouses working from home. And then you have people who, prior to this, were always in the office. And so learning to work remotely and learning to work without people who normally they would turn to and speak face to face. And then think about the impact that has on managers too, and having to cope with, managing a remote team is very different from managing a team that you see in the office every day. So I think those are all experiences that are not unique to any one part of the world. I think that everywhere is experiencing these same things, but at an individual level, I think they're experienced quite differently. I think at the same time, this is a global experience, but at the same time, in a lot of ways, it is accelerating a trend that we saw beforehand toward deglobalization. You think about a lot, one of the first things that happened in this is the national borders became very, very clear, and the barriers went up, and there were I remember even when I arrived in India at the end of February, coming from Singapore, there was a separate line that we had to go through and all get screened and questionnaire to fill out and everything like that. No quarantine yet, but that was that was the experience, which was very different than when I'd been in India in December. I'm not singling out India for any reason, others have gone far further than that. But I think, in the context of, how do we go from being in a very globalized environment, especially as a multinational, how do you go from being in a very globalized environment to a world that is much less globalized all of a sudden? How do you maintain business continuity? One of the things, that we and I'm sure other companies had to struggle with is how do you actually get contracts signed? In some countries require wedding signatures. Well, what if, the person who has authorization to do the wedding signature doesn't happen to have a printer or a scanner at home? And oh, by the way, the entire city is sold out of printers and scanners because everybody realized they had the same problem. These are very practical considerations that, I think you need to work through and consider just how to keep the systems running. Especially for a company like Microsoft, where I mentioned the digital transformation before, people are depending on our services, Microsoft Teams and Azure suddenly take on this huge importance. How do you keep those running while at the same time maintaining the employee safety? And I think that goes, over to what Amit was talking about too, the importance of communication, transparency, making sure that employees remain a priority. And how do you message that as a company? I think, there is this tension between, do you prioritize your employees or do you prioritize your customers to make sure that the services get delivered? Personally, I think that is a false choice. I think by prioritizing your employees, you ensure that you have business continuity and that your customers continue to be served. If you go out and are very public in your communication saying we will continue to serve our customers come what may, and neglect your employees, you'll find yourself very quickly without employees, or at least not employees that are willing to do what's being asked of them. And I think we've seen that with some companies as well. So. And then while everybody is going through this process of trying to understand how to work from home, then as well at the same time trying to plan for a reopening and what that looks like. And I think what we see across the region is the decision of how to go back to work and when to go back to work is not consistent across countries. It's not consistent even across regions within large countries. You take a look currently in Asia, you have China is open, you have Hong Kong and Taiwan are open, you have New Zealand, which is more or less open, but at the same time, and you have Korea that never really officially shut down. And then at the same time, you have other countries like India, like Singapore that are locked down and like strictly locked down. And how do you, and Bangladesh as well is in that situation. So then how do you balance that where you essentially you have a hybrid workforce where some of the workforce is at home, some of the workforce is able to go into the office, and that's a challenge, poses a challenge as well. So I think everything that everybody's been talking about at the experience in India is not at all different from what we're seeing in the region around the world, just understanding that the experience in every region can be quite different.
Sure. I mean, the funny thing I remembered is, Jerem, is there's a very popular meme now on social media where they're interviewing one CTO of a large company and saying, this is supposed to be in 2024, and said, which person led your digital transformation? And the CTO says it's not which person, it's COVID-19 which led the transformation. Yeah,
I saw that too. And seriously, that is just, everybody when this first hit wondered, what is this going to mean for Microsoft? What is this going to mean? And I think we saw really quickly within the first couple of weeks what this was going to mean for Microsoft. And it was, for those of us who are employees, it was pretty scary, and, but in a different way for some other companies. And now we're coping. I was saying just before we started that we've got our fiscal year end at the end of this month. It's full on busy. It's a really, really challenging time, in a different way than some other companies have experienced. And so I think that brings up a good point as well for managing employees, understanding too, that while other people may not be working, if you're one of those companies that is full on working, understand that burnout can be a much more critical issue than at other times, not just because people are more busy, but because they're dealing with the stresses of a changed working environment and as well the stresses of just the low level anxiety that exists in this kind of environment.
Absolutely. And that ties into, I think, something which you said which is very thought-provoking is, while work from home, the rules of engagement are pretty much similar across the globe, but even at a personal level, work from home is very different for every individual. Some may have infrastructure issues, some may have, a perspective issue. Some may actually not work very well from home. Some work fantastically from home. So even that work from home is so personal, and I couldn't agree more with what you said. And I'm seeing that with my own team actually, where I think I'm the one who's lagging behind everybody way ahead. So anyway, on that note, I'll bring in Manishi now. Manishi, from your and because we belong to a large law firm, and we advise that way from a very objective basis because we are external counsel. Our sort of buy-in is only so much. But from your experience of how are you seeing across different sectors and different companies and their sizes and their strengths and their cultures, how are you seeing the rules of engagement, getting changed or getting enforced nowadays?
Okay, thanks, Avik. See, what I see, as we see from a organized, structured or organized sector to unorganized sector, there have been different surprises for both. Even within the organized sector, when we look at the services sector and the manufacturing sector, the type or the sort of challenges that both have faced are actually to a large extent different. Amit and Nanjappa and Jerome have already covered part of it. The protocols that the government introduced in 3 months, how rapidly they have changed, and how the Ministry of Health and Finance has brought in some more changes. Government advisories, government orders being issued, and strict enforcement being expected from the employers. There has been a lot of changes that have been introduced in the last 3-4 months. And I wouldn't say that many clients that we represent or have reached out to us were prepared to deal with this. I am aware that there were some who still had policies on work from home, were probably better prepared than some of the people in the market. But still, it has brought in a lot of challenges and a lot of issues related to all these dimensions that this COVID-19 has added. Work from home policy has brought in challenges in terms of how the health and safety issues will be addressed. How will an employer be able, or the statute will be able to extend the insurance or protection under the Employee State Insurance Act or Employee Compensation Act. How an employer is going to manage its workforce to come to its workplace and deliver the job when they are allowed to operate. So there are different dimensions of challenges that have come up. Government has already put out some SOPs. They have expected self-declaration to be given. The Ministry of Home Affairs brings in one national directive. Then Ministry of Health and Family Welfare issued another set of guidelines on June 4th. So there are different things that have got in place. But I think what has made people understand and how the workforce environment is going to change, health and safety and compliance is going to become more important for many of the companies. Policies that were probably taken more lightly, there were some responsibilities delegated to the people given the designation or the experience that they had or the qualification they had. I think they're going to be the centerpiece for many people. In some of the sectors like manufacturing and all, industrial relations used to be a world which is almost forgotten by many. In my view, that's going to come back, and relationship between an employer and employee is going to take the center stage. The role of HR is going to become more important in times to come. As of today, we see under the statutes, and as we'll discuss during the rest of the discussion, a lot of emphasis has been on the employer to ensure that there are health and safety compliances that you do. But it would not be unusual in times to come that to engage an employer to retain a good talent, employer would be expected to showcase that they have a safe place to work. They have good policies that are going to be comforting not only for the employees, but also safeguard the interest of the family associated with them. Because majority of the statute that we look in India do not give you a substantial amount of money that can sustain the families. So probably it's not going to be left to simply paying the state insurance or ensuring that employer is covering only the Employment Compensation Act aspect, but there will be a need to introduce more employee-friendly policies, insurance policies, which not only protect the employees, but also exonerate the risk of employer. Also, I see a lot of reputational issues coming up. So far, the employers are concerned because if there are issues found at workplace, or if somebody is found to have been infected at workplace, then that's going to bring a goodwill or reputation risk for employees. So they would be expected to bring in some policies that will be comforting for the employees. Corporate governance is going to be an important aspect, because whether we look at compliance checks, anything else, it actually leads to the management of the company. So it is not going to be left to the individuals who are performing a role and just pass on the onus to them. And I think if you recall, many of the MHA orders that were pronounced, they provided, they quoted sections specifically which talk about the board members and how they could be convicted for an offense. So I think it's going to be not merely simply, ticking the checkbox, but it's going to be more stringent compliance aspects to be looked at from the company's perspective, more policies from especially in a work from home environment, the IT policies and confidentiality policies will have to become more stringent.
Absolutely. I mean, I think from what I take away, Manishi, is that compliance will not be lip service anymore. I mean, that way we're going to probably even use this as an opportunity to progress further ahead, where compliance will be looked at far more substantively, both by the employer as well as the regulator. And that's the only way to go forward, because we have a lot more at stake.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. So
if I could just
Jared,
chime in on that. I do think that that's true. I think that at the same time, whenever we have a crisis, that sometimes the instinct of the lawyers is to kind of jump right in, get involved, and worry about the liability and the risk to the company. I think that that's an important voice to make sure is in the room. At the same time, I think that when there is a crisis that affects employees or affects the company, letting the other professionals in the room do their job, and sometimes stepping back as the lawyer can be critically important. Letting HR professionals do what HR professionals are supposed to do. Letting the comms professionals do what the comms professionals are supposed to do. Make sure, of course, that they do the right thing, but the right thing as determined by them with the right incentives in mind. Worry about liability later sometimes, because there may be liabilities and those can't be controlled, but making sure that comms is able to, present the position of the company out there, and make sure that HR is able to manage the situation where they need to as well, I think is important.
I'm not going to let Nanjappa speak on this, because if I have to ask him his grievances, it's going to take a couple of more hours. But where I'm going to bring in Nanjappa is, a very interesting question that somebody, Surbhi, actually posed to us. And quickly, I mean, how is the HR ecosystem grappling with the issue that how to avoid employee burnout? Because this is a time where burnout, I think, is a reality.
See, there are two parts to this in my view, and over time, our investment in a culture that's engaging, and a culture where we've put in a lot of investment into wellness as a practice, is now, I think, yielding good results. I mean, there are many things I can talk about, but the important things are, one, the ownership has to be with the employee and the employer. I think it has to be shared ownership. So there are parts that the organization will create ecosystem and set of offerings that employees will dig into. But at the same time, it's important that employees and teams preserve themselves. So it's a bit of both. We started with just having a set of things that employees could use, and then we let them be. But eventually, when we got to a place where we thought this has to be effective, we needed to bring in more ownership. So when you involve employees and put them at the center and try to do a lot of these programs, because of the ownership, the usage goes up and then the effectiveness goes up. So that's one part of it. Second is we've constantly relooked at, for example, take wellness as a program. For the longest time, what we've tried to do is include wellness into the everyday lives of employees, integrate into every policy. If your wellness program doesn't talk to other parts of your organization, this is actually not going to work at all. So in everything that you do, some of these things have to be integrated. And when that is integrated, these things work. The third thing which has helped organizations is their investment in teams. If you really look at organizations across, one of the reasons why people come to work is the teams that they work in. I mean, the organization is very far away for many of them.
Mm-hmm.
So the teams actually benefit a lot.
I mean, that cliche that you don't leave your company, you leave your boss.
Yeah. So, and people actually love working for their teams more than anything else.
Yeah.
So bulk of the reason, and when I saw some research and said people would want to go back to their old companies or their previous companies only because of the teams that they work with. So teams form a very important emotional ecosystem in this whole thing. And if you dig deeper, it's about having a best friend at work.
Yeah.
So those are some of the things that have always helped employees and teams wade through tough times. But having said that, that's at a very local level. But at a larger level, good companies obviously invest a lot in creating a setup where employees are at the center of this whole thing.
No, absolutely. I mean, I mean, from what my guess would be, and I think what you were trying to say, Nanjappa, is that you have to ensure that people don't burn out. The organization and HR in particular has to be ahead of the curve. I mean, it had to be a long-term game where you're reaping the benefits now. If you started yesterday, you're probably far more in danger than the people who've always thought this to be a priority.
Absolutely. And like I said, the support system happens at a very holistic level. I mean, there's stuff that is for social wellness, there's stuff that is focused on emotional wellness, there's stuff that's going on from a safety point of view, there's stuff that's going on from a physical wellness point of view. It's very holistic approach to, creating such an environment. I mean, there will be outliers, there'll be burnouts and things like that. And you have enough checks and balances to make sure that, some of those things are detected very early. That's what I was trying to say. I mean, one is having a holistic framework, two, have checks and balances to detect this early, and three, it has to be an employee-employer ownership and not with just one party.
Sure, absolutely. So
I'll just make a quick point there. I think I think burnout is a challenge which I think Nanjappa clearly articulated that how it's a joint effort between the employer and the employee. And I think in these unprecedented times, I think where everybody, and I think even this panel probably referred to it initially in the discussions, resilience is what is going to define which businesses survive and thrive in this environment. Right? So I think it is the onus of both the employees, the leaders, and the organization to make sure that they are resilient, that they're doing everything, they ensure that their commitment to the work during this time of crisis is absolute. And I think burnout, while it's a reality, but these are unprecedented times we're living in. So one does have to be a little bit more attuned and acceptable to some of the challenges that may come across, which means just longer hours, I guess.
No, absolutely, Amit. But I think something that I don't know if it will be fair to equate, but something that you mentioned in the opening minutes of this webinar is you said that as an organization, you're also looking out and discouraging opportunistic behavior. Now, resilience can sometimes, this is my personal opinion, resilience sometimes can be also misunderstood, where employees may feel that they're being taken for granted or taken advantage of. I think the hallmark of an effective organization is that they're transparent, and while they stand for resilience, it is equal across the board.
Agreed.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll quickly jump to the next topic, and Amit, I'll begin with you. Are you predicting? I'll give you an example. Let's say safety protocol breaches, overtime, employee expectations, performance review. Are you seeing or are you predicting disputes of a different nature?
Well, so this is these are some of the things that we, as a team and myself, have thought through and we've discussed with some of our colleagues as well. I've seen certain instances cropping up. I won't go into details of anything, but I think the risks are out there, as in spite of all the good work that an organization can do to implement sophisticated controls, policies, ensuring best-in-class protocols, sanitization, health checks, technology-based assessments. In spite of that, there will be instances where there will be employees who feel that they were put at risk because of them coming to work. Now, in a manufacturing setup, it is not entirely possible to have a work from home scenario. You cannot. It is different from a service sector, and I think that's the reality of operating in a manufacturing space. And I think one thing to understand is that most support functions are really there existing to support the large part of the organization that is coming to work day in, day out at our manufacturing facilities, producing those life essential medicines that are distributed across the globe. So it's a global supply chain. Now we are there to support it. Potentially there could be disputes that could come in relation to this management of employee health and safety. Leaves during periods of self-isolation, whether they'll qualify as paid sick leave or unpaid leave, voluntary absences from work. If you travel during this crisis, during the time when travel restrictions are in place, whether if you're quarantined on your way to a destination and quarantined on your way back to a destination, how will that get treated by the organization? Whether you can ask employees to use up your annual leaves in relation to these absences, non-adherence by employees to safety protocols, whether as disciplinary action that could be potentially get taken, or the risks that get created because somebody did not give the right information or the correct information, or and put other organization as well as the other colleagues at risk. Challenges around in data privacy, in fact, where organizations are trying to build up technological solutions for self-assessment, for contact tracing, for declaring their health in the conditions that they are operating in. Challenges around managing that data also could potentially be another potential risk. I'm not saying there could be disputes. By and large, if you ask me, I would resist a dispute in this scenario. My advice to my colleagues and my management would be that if there is, in this scenario, we obviously have to have clear rules, but we have to be empathetic and we have to listen and look out for what could be a principled view from an employee. But if there is any misuse or behavior that is not permissible and is not in the larger organizational conduct, obviously that cannot never be tolerated. Now, so obviously the idea is there could be disputes, but it's not a conducive environment for a dispute. This is when we are talking about only the employment issues here, right? I won't even larger commercial issues that are operating because of So the whole idea is best to avoid a dispute, best to see how you can resolve a situation fairly quickly without actually letting it escalate into a dispute.
Fair enough. I get what you're saying. Nanjapa, I'll quickly bring you here. So I'll give you an example. So let's say performance review. And performance review often, and I'm sure Amit, Jaram, and Manishi will agree with me. Performance review is not only about the deliverables that you give to your boss, but it's also about certain behavioral things, about how you fit in, about things that you do which is conducive to the environment. Are you seeing different tone of conversations? Are you seeing, or are you predicting maybe disputes may change or they may be on the rise in the near future?
So, Avik, it's a very pertinent question, but I've been always a big fan of not trying to get to a zero occurrence model than anything else, which means there has to be heavy focus on creating a culture of continuous involvement with employees, engaging with them, getting their voice, feedback, and change. Because if that happens, then the propensity of this issue itself will be much lower. And we can invest in the front end of the process. We will be able to, and it's directly proportional to what happens at the back end of the process. And I think that's what we should continuously figure out. Obviously, we need to have very strong mechanisms in the organization to deal with some of these issues. But having said that, that's not the focus. The focus should be on the front end. That's very important. Second, because if you look at take IT industry as an example. Traditionally, we just had on-site and offshore as two places that people work from. Today, look at the scenario. There is offshore home, offshore office, and offshore client. And then there's on-site home, on-site client, and on-site office. So there are, from 2, we move to 6, which means it's become that much more complex, and teams are globally situated. So this is not as simple as it seems, which means some of the disputes that come up will be new and some will be renewed. And the new ones will largely be, and I think the panel spoke about the whole health and safety part. What is the workplace? A workplace injury means what? How will this whole thing look at? That's one. Second, new aspects could be in the framework of information security, data privacy, conflict of interest. I mean, we haven't even gone in that direction. Dual employment, we don't even know. So that's the whole new game, I think, which we could predict. In the whole performance management, and especially managerial and team related, would be critical, because the expectations of what a team is going to change. The expectation of who a manager is going to change. In different segments of the employee population, we may not even need a manager. It could be self-governed in many places. So there are so many different facets to this. And depending on which segment the person belongs to, the protocols and the modus operandi would be very different. So while some of those older versions will continue, but we could see a lot more newer versions. I was discussing with a colleague the other day, even in the realm of sexual harassment, the whole thing is going to move digital, which means most people have to be very clear about what they want to do socially, digitally, and things like that, more than the ones that happened in the past, which was proximity based. So, those are things that need to be looked at, but definitely the teams and the manager and those aspects will be critical. Performance management also, because clarity of goals, how groups will come together to deal with this whole situation is very important, because it'll be very interdependent. Work itself will kind of be redesigned, because one person will not do the entire job, it will be broken up. So it's very important that the intensity of engagement becomes a lot more. The intensity of feedback becomes a lot more in real time. So that will kind of possibly have less surprises at the end of the cycle.
Absolutely. I think we will see a seismic shift, and I completely agree that, especially with sexual harassment, I mean, because you're changing the paradigm completely, because you are going to lead this kind of a digital life, at least in the near future. So, and same goes for performance goals also. How do you communicate effectively what you need somebody who reports to you, what he or she needs to do? Because you can't blame him or her if you've not communicated well. So I'll bring in Manishi now. Manishi, I mean, external counsels like you and I, we get involved in disputes, not often at a preemptive stage, but more often than not at a stage where it is either already a full-blown dispute or on the verge of becoming a sort of a confrontation. Are you predicting changes, new kinds of disputes from a purely legal perspective?
So Avik, I think I'll not predict anything, because there's a risk to prediction. But
as COVID has taught us.
Yeah. I think what Amit and Nanjappa said, I agree with them, because amongst all other disputes, health and safety related disputes are likely to get added to the list. While some of the traditional disputes, performance and disciplinary issues, they are probably going to take the center stage in terms of how well companies are keeping record and how well they are prepared in terms of ensuring that performance is being adequately or appropriately recorded, because they will not be personal measures. So, except for the fact that communication is going to be, or rather over communication is going to become a key between the managers and the subordinates. The manner in which the performance is going to be judged and communicated and being recorded, that's going to become a key to the performance issues in times to come. It has always been the key, but somehow it had been, I would say it had been in several companies overlooked to a certain extent. So performance is, health and safety is going to get added to the dispute list. What I personally feel, and now I'm not saying it's a prediction, but what I personally feel that probably more collective movements are likely to happen, because employees have realized that by being staggered and not being together, they probably are not going to get the benefit. And with the government advisories and all these coming out, people have realized the risk of not being together. So companies may have to deal with more collective actions from the employees. Possibility of increase in number of unions may go up. And I would say in both sectors, manufacturing and services sector, both, the probabilities are high. In fact, there were already unions coming up in IT and IT sectors in different states. I think they're probably going to take a formal shape. In the collective agreement, health and safety is going to become an important aspect that unions may want to discuss and may want to seek some additional insurance coverage. Apart from comfort from the employer, that employer is going to ensure that he offers a comfortable and a safe workplace to employees.
Well, absolutely. I mean, health and safety, and this is, I think, been a long-term grounds for somebody like you, me, and even Amit, that we always feel as lawyers that there is not enough documentation, not enough recording on paper of what is going on between, and especially the employment law field, where we've spoken with our clients, our HR representatives, that how do I prove 2 months later that you had this discussion with this fellow? I mean, if it's not on email. But yeah, but those kind of issues, I completely agree, Manishi, is going to get only magnified now. And if there is not enough of a culture, it probably companies are going to suffer. So I know we're running out of time. So what I'm going to do is
just a quick point.
Yeah, Amit, sure.
Just a quick point there, Avik, just a quick point. I think even the last statement that you made, I think there is a silver lining even in that. I think with all the technology-enabled solutions that we are seeing, at least in the Lupin context, thanks to Microsoft Teams, a lot of the interaction is happening digitally. A lot of the interaction possibly is recordable. Whenever there are groups coming together, when there is an important point being discussed, that gets recorded. So I think there is a lot more open transparency today. And I think who said what kind of issues are getting impacted already. And I see in a positive way. So it's always, I see a silver lining there.
Yeah, you can always refer, 1 month back in a Zoom call, this is what you said. Yeah, but I'll get in Jaram here quickly. Jaram, moving on to the next and our last question in this webinar, how are you seeing across Asia in the regions that you are leading your teams? How are you seeing the government's perspective, and how are you seeing the market taking the new regulations and the new laws that are changing almost like every other day because of the crisis? How are you seeing the government? Can you give us a bit of a difference on the government's perspectives and also the way people are taking it across Asia?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting topic that you could spend a lot of time discussing. A lot of countries have very different perspectives. They're having very different epidemics, frankly, as part of the global pandemic. And so the responses are quite different. The measures are very different. There are some common themes that come across, in terms of the need for social distancing. But then, whether social distancing means 1 meter or 1.5 meters or 2 meters or 3 meters, apparently it's catchier in some countries than others. And so it is a little bit, there certainly is a flavor and a personality to every government in the region, in terms of how strict they are imposing things. And a lot of that has to do with facts on the ground. You look at a place like New Zealand that has now reported 0 cases and has declared, that they can open up entirely. Internally, they can open up entirely, but they're keeping their borders closed. You have other countries like China, that has largely been there and is on the other side now. And so the restrictions there look quite different as compared to a place like Singapore that seemed to manage everything quite well initially, but now is grappling with a second wave. They're coming in and we're still in a lockdown situation. Well, it's not a lockdown so much. We're in what they're calling a safe reopening phase right now. But then the contact tracing approach is quite different than in other places. They've just announced that there will be a wearable device that will be distributed to all Singaporeans for contact tracing purposes. There was quite a lot of chatter announced at that around what implications that has for privacy, and the privacy implications of that. I think for employers, there are requirements that are being put on employers as well. I think, we saw that in India's case, that, there were certain responsibilities being put on employers. And I think that when you do that and when you impose certain employer responsibility over certain contact tracing measures or certain information. I mean, if you're expecting employers now to collect health information of employees that you may not have collected before, that's information of a much different nature than employers are used to dealing with. And so, understanding the privacy regimes that are in place in various countries and understanding how that data may need to be handled, I think that was something that Amit brought up as well, is something that can be challenging from place to place. So I think to answer the role, the question on the role government plays in enforcing these norms, they set what the norms are supposed to be, but it is all in the context of there are legal implications that can come in and affect how these things need to be implemented. And it goes clear across from data privacy and contract tracing to the social distancing requirements, and how offices now need to be arranged and set up can differ from country to country. And just a final point as well is on, we touched on it as well, the nature of an essential service and what qualifies as an essential service. And that will impact, the types of businesses that can remain open. In some place like in Singapore, they were saying that hair salons could remain open when they were saying, there were only essential services that were required. Whereas I know in other places, you couldn't get a haircut if you wanted to, outside of whoever is able to do it in your own home. Not so much a problem for me. But, I think that, for Microsoft, because we operate a number of data centers around the world on behalf of our clients, it's what enables Teams meetings to happen. It's what enables, continued collaboration and email to be it's what's enabling the work from home culture. Having to explain that sometimes to governments and help them to understand, hey, this doesn't happen entirely automated. There are people that need to go to data centers to make sure that they remain functioning, and help government. Some governments understood that initially and brought out those those clarifications. Others we needed to have a conversation with. So I think that the government's role in enforcing these norms is really to set out on the basis backed by science, what is the type of epidemic that we are experiencing now? What are our social dynamics in terms of how people move about, how they interact, how they live, and what needs to be done to protect the citizens, that's the tone that they need to set, and then companies needing to respond to that in the context of the broader regulatory environment that's already set up. And when you're doing that across borders, it becomes an added challenge as well.
Absolutely. Because of the nature of the pandemic and how, that way, customized it is for a jurisdiction, the rules of engagement are very different. Some governments can afford to be far more lenient than perhaps India at this point of time. So yes, we completely understand, but yeah, it is what it is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick, we're really badly ran out of time. I wish we could continue this, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick one question for each panelist, and that's how we'll conclude. I'll next address it to Manishi. Manishi, there's a lot of questions about employee confidentiality and how you can protect and the kind of recourses that an employer has, and what kind of already risk mitigation measures should employers take. Can we have your thoughts about this?
You see, confidentiality is an aspect which is primarily covered through the contract. That is the only thing which the Indian statutes provide. So the more stringent or stricter the confidentiality clause that a company has, the better protected it is. And we have been able and we have been successful in enforcing the confidentiality obligations, which are very not only very legal but also practical. Through several courts, we have been able to get appropriate reliefs. In some cases, we also have been able to get damages for the breach of confidentiality. So I would not be too much concerned about the confidentiality aspect as long as company has enough documentation, language, which is not merely legal, but also from a practical perspective. So if you have just used a confidentiality as one of the clauses and you have just copy pasted, that probably is not going to be enough for an employer. Employer probably need to customize a clause suitable to its needs to ensure that he or she or the employer is in a position to enforce the protection that he has under the confidentiality.
Absolutely, and just my 2 bits to add to what Manishi said, and what he's laid out is completely the position and how you should go about it. Also remember the gentleman who asked the question, certain breaches of confidentiality can have even criminal, perspective, criminal liability perspective to it. So there are a lot of recourses available, but what Manishi said is absolutely right. What you need to really prepare and also address is how your documentation is drafted and the language and the processes that you have. My next quick question will be to Amit. Amit, given that you're in such a senior management role and also that your duties also, India and Asia Pacific, do you think managers, middle managers, senior managers, junior managers, do you think they need special kind of training for dealing in a situation like this? Because I think these remote rules are not going to stay for some time. Do you think managers need training?
I think so, definitely. And I think that question is related to all the previous discussion that we've been having. There is an evolution of the regulatory, the legal positions around labor laws, that everything is evolving. There is static in some places, but I think in the Indian context, definitely there are movements. We're all familiar with what's happening in state of Gujarat and Madhya Pradesh. There are proposals for giving a complete 3-year holiday from the labor laws to incentivize business. So I think a large part of dealing with this crisis, both for business and the governments, is going to be how do you incentivize more investments? How do you get the business going? How do you actually make use of this opportunity? At the beginning of this session, we all agreed leaders are looking at this as an opportunity, and rightly so. Now, to actually make use of that opportunity, how do you, steamroll, push along things? That would mean labor law holidays. That could mean more aggressive ways of working. That could mean new, policies at the work front that we are bringing in. That could mean new policies around, interactions around safety and health. And all of that, to deal with all of that, there is definitely a requirement for upskilling, which would be required. So today, I would say, at a middle management level or a manager level, which is, or depending on the scale, unskilled labor or the employees that a particular manager is managing, the skills that are required are quite varied. I mean, just in the Lupin case, I mean, we've done phenomenal things in this last 3 months of lockdown. We've gone ahead and implemented an entire helpline where employees could initially call up and talk to dedicated healthcare, mental health professionals. They could talk to respiratory, pulmonologists if they had any issues around COVID. That helpline was then opened up to the public as well in various cities. And there was a large CSR activity which was being done with the help of various people from admin to take care of this whole migrant. People were called along to do crisis management, to go beyond what their normal day jobs were prior to crisis. And I think that kind of effort is going to continue. People will be leaned upon to do what they were normally asked to do in their pre-COVID crisis. And that entails definitely a requirement to upskill, to train, and to learn. And I think that's the opportunity which is available to all of us.
Fair enough.
That's how I would answer.
I know we're running badly out of time. So my last question is, again, it's a very common question in the Q&A section of the call. This is both to Jarom and Nanjappa. Is apart from, and this ties into what we started early, began the conversation with, apart from digital transformation, what other silver linings do you see in engagement with the workforce which has come out of this crisis? To both Jarom and Nanjappa.
After you, Jarom.
Well, I was going to let you go first, but I'll say a couple of things. I think the first thing that came to mind after the digital transformation point, the first thing that came to mind, I think, is just, honestly, I think there's a greater empathy for people. I think there's a greater understanding that people have lives outside of work. And I think that there's more willingness to give people grace in that, to be able to recognize that, we are not just cogs in the wheel, not just automatons, but that, everybody has challenges, everybody is dealing with stuff, and that, and that's okay, and that we need to give each other a break once in a while. I do think that I think some of what we're seeing, even, with the other thing that's making the news right now, especially in the United States, with talking about social injustice and racism, I think a lot, frankly, I don't think that I do think that the pandemic situation does have an effect on the reason that is taking place now. That there is this increased sense of empathy, and I do think that it is. I think that is, we can point to that and see that, positive or negatively, as an effect that the pandemic is having on society as a whole. And I do think that will, whether that will continue forever, I don't know, but I do think that is likely to continue, at least in the short term.
Absolutely. Nanjappa?
So very quickly, one, of course, will definitely be about localization. When I say localization, both at countries and even within organization, it will be at teams. I think they will become stronger and stronger. Your local ecosystem is going to define a lot of these things than ever before. The empowerment will be a lot more locally, like I said, both in organizations and in countries. And that's going to be a big silver lining. And that's important because the nuances of what happens locally is understood only by the folks. Even in a dispute, my belief is that the resolution should happen closest to where the problem arises and not somewhere far away. So I think localization will be one big silver lining. The second will be the work-life integration. I've always been a big fan of having to watch Netflix on a Wednesday afternoon and having a big meeting or an office call on a Sunday morning. It actually shouldn't matter because finally it's the same person. And if you can get the best out of yourself on a Sunday morning or a Saturday morning, so be it. And then do a good job of a movie on a Wednesday afternoon. So the workplace and the work-life integration is here to stay. But I want to end with, I was thinking about and reading about a few things about how it's so opposites, a life of opposites in today's setup. On one hand, we are saying we have to collaborate, but at the same time, we have to isolate. At one hand, we are saying we have to be global, and yet most of things are relevant locally. And at one level, we are saying you have to trust, but when you step out, there's so much of skepticism at the same level of trust. So it's very interesting, the times that we are in, but looking forward, like I said, it's a great opportunity.
So gentlemen, I mean, Amit, Jaram, Nanjappa, Manishi, this has been a fabulous discussion, and believe me, I don't say this often for webinar discussions. So thank you very much for your time. And I hope everybody who logged in also had an equally good time as all of us on this panel. So thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you, folks. It was fantastic.
Thank you.